Welcome back, everybody, to Lecture 2 for Chapter 11. Remember, I told you last time at the end of the last video that we're going to be picking it up here with this conflict or this controversy about how well the economy corrects itself. So, as we talked about in the last video, there are three mechanisms that suggest the economy can correct itself fairly quickly. One of which is that consumption, which is the largest component of GDP, tends to stay relatively stable as people like to smooth out their consumption cycles regardless of what's going on in the economy. Right. The second reason why the economy might be able to correct itself is because changes in real interest rates could influence consumption or investment in such a way to bring the economy back to full employment. And then the third and final reason why the economy might correct itself is that natural changes in resource prices, like wages, could also bring the economy back to full employment. So with that in mind, how quickly the economy corrects itself is up for debate, and this is a debate that really started with the Great Depression. So before the Great Depression, most economists and people around believed in this thing that we call classical economics. Classical because that's kind of how economic thought originated. But then when the Great Depression happened, people started to look at economics a little bit differently. So before the Great Depression, the economy always moved in those business cycles that we talked about in Chapter 8. There were expansions and peaks that were followed by contractions and troughs, and so forth and so on. The economy would go up for a little while, then it'd go down for a little while, go up for a little while, and then go down for a little while. Again, we couldn't predict exactly when those cycles would happen, but we just knew that the economy would move in cycles. But then we had this huge stock market crash in 1929, and then a Great Depression that followed all the way up to the mid-1940s afterwards, where the economy seemed to not only go down, but stay down for about a 15-year period. And during that period, there was an economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes, who was doing most of his work, and he kind of explored what was happening during the Great Depression and suggested that what we thought was true in economics before might not necessarily be that true, and the economy will stay down until we actually do something to bring the economy out of that recession or depression. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the difference between classical and Keynesian economics, right? This is two different schools of economic thought that economists today are kind of disagree on or separate themselves into. So today we have some economists who are classical economists and then some economists who are Keynesian economists. And we'll talk about the difference between those two camps or those two schools of thought here in this video. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about classical economics first, because that's kind of what you've been learning up to this point with the self-correcting economy, and that's the one that you're probably going to be most familiar with. So classical economics believes that market and resource prices are flexible, and this will allow the economy to self-correct fairly quickly. In other words, when there's a recession, interest rates tend to go down. That will cause people to consume and invest more, stimulate aggregate demand, and pull us out of that recession. Or during a recession, wages tend to go down, and again, that will cause us to want to hire more people and produce more and pull us out of that recession. And it will all happen naturally without any extra or government intervention. Right. At the same token, if there's an expansion, right, interest rates tend to go up. That's going to reduce consumption, investment, and pull us down from that expansion. Or during that expansion, wages tend to go up. That means we'll hire fewer people, produce less stuff, and again, that will calm us down from that expansion without the need for any government action. So that's the idea behind classical economics. There's a few other things that classical economists believe. In order to explore that, we're going to go ahead and make a T-chart here to compare classical and Keynesian economics. So I'm going to start over here with the classical. That's kind of the side that, again, we are most familiar with so far. And then we are going to be comparing that with the Keynesian economics, which we're going to go put over here on the other side. All right. So first of all, during this time period of the 1930s and 40s, when Keynesian economics was kind of making its big debut, classical economics was still being championed by an individual by the name of Friedrich August von Hayek. It's supposed to be in blue for the classical side. Again, we call this person Friedrich August von Hayek, or as he's affectionately known, just F.A. Hayek. And he was kind of like the counter-intellectual to what Keynes was coming up with at the time. So he wrote books that kind of refuted or was in direct contrast to the things that Keynes was perhaps suggesting. Right, so with that in mind, he was kind of like the intellectual component of Keynes, but this was during a time period where it was okay to disagree with people without it necessarily being wrong or right, just two competing or different ideas, right? So this is where, again, not like today where people are kind of at each other's throats when they disagree about whatever political or economic opinions they might have, right? Again, they had a mutual respect for one another. But in any case, when we're talking about classical economics, again, here's the things that classical economists tend to believe. First and foremost is, again, that prices are flexible. Meaning that they can go down during a recession or up during expansion. And again, that's going to help redirect the economy. So because prices are flexible, the economy can correct itself fairly quickly. So again, when it comes to classical economics, they believe in this idea of a self-correcting economy. As long as you leave it alone and allow it to correct itself, it certainly will, and can do so pretty quickly. Now, classical economists also believe in this thing called Say's law, named after the economist Say who came up with it. And this is the idea that supply creates demand. And another way of saying this is that it's production that matters. So if you're a classical economist, you believe in this idea that it's production that's really important. When we go out there and we produce things like shoes or lamps or houses, right, that's what makes us richer as an economy. Because when we produce these things, then we're going to give people the money to go out there and buy those things. So through the production of a house or a lamp or a pair of shoes, you're going to pay workers to produce those things. That's going to give them the money to go out there and spend that money on other stuff, right? And then that's going to lead to more production, which is going to lead to more demand or consumption, right? So again, it's the production that matters. It's the supply that's important for creating demand. And then finally, what makes classical economists different than Keynesians is that classical economists believe in guidepost number 3 that we talked about back in chapter 1, where that is that people respond to economic calculation. Or another way of saying this is that incentives matter. Again, that's our guidepost number 3. If the benefit of an action goes up, people are going to be more willing to undergo that action. If the cost of an action goes up, people are going to be less willing to undergo that action, right? So again, people respond to incentives in a pretty predictable way. So if interest rates were to go down as a result of a recession, then yes, we expect people to consume and invest more as a result. Or if wages were to go down as a result of a recession, we'd expect people to, again, hire more employees and produce more. And so that's kind of the classical side of things. Right. Now, with that in mind, we're going to kind of segue from that into Keynesian economics. So Keynesian economics believe that market and resource prices are inflexible, so they're not going to adjust, at least not nearly as quickly as the classical economists say they will, and therefore the market will not be able to correct itself, or again, at least not quickly like the classical economists believe. So let's go into what Keynesian economists believe. Right. And again, this was a school of thought or philosophy championed by John Maynard Keynes, who wrote during the Great Depression. His most famous book is The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which he published in 1936, which is right in the heart of the Great Depression. And this kind of laid the groundwork for fiscal or monetary policy, or in other words, these kind of last 4 chapters that we are going to be going over in this class is essentially going to be the result of this Keynesian school of thought or Keynesian philosophy. All right, so again, this was championed by John Maynard Keynes. And some important things to kind of note about John Maynard Keynes is he was considered one of the leading intellectuals at the time. He was considered kind of one of the smartest people around. With that in mind, remember it was after World War I that Keynes suggested not making Germany pay those reparation payments that led to that hyperinflation, which we talked about in Chapter 8, which further ostracized Germany and caused them to, again, start electing people like Adolf Hitler to power and led into World War II. In other words, if people had listened to John Maynard Keynes after World War I, you might have not had World War II at all. Right. So again, he was considered incredibly brilliant at the time and one of the most prolific thinkers during this time period. And the same can be said for F.A. Hayek as well. So again, they're considered pretty big intellectual opposites, as well as kind of the best in their game at the time. But in terms of what the Keynesian economists believe is, again, this is going to be the exact opposite. So they believe that prices are inflexible. Or as Keynes referred to it, prices are sticky, particularly in a downward direction. So in other words, it's not quite as easy or automatic to lower things like prices or interest rates or wages as we might think it would be. And we're going to talk a little bit about why he thought that here in a few minutes. But for now, just know that he thought that prices were not going to adjust. And if interest rates, wages, and prices don't go down during a recession, then you don't have a reason to consume and invest more or hire more people or produce more stuff. So the economy won't be able to pull itself out of that recession. In other words, the economy cannot correct itself. Or at least not quickly or naturally. So in other words, if we want to pull the economy out of recession, there's something we're going to have to do to it to help stimulate it and help pull it again back towards full employment. Now, unlike the classical economists, Keynesians believe that demand creates its own supply. It's kind of the opposite of Say's law. Or another way of saying this is that Keynes was all about making it rain, or it's that spending that matters. So whereas Say's law says that, hey, when we produce stuff, that's going to give people the money to buy stuff, Keynes says, hey, when people buy stuff, that's what gives us the incentive to produce it. Right? So in other words, it's this idea that we need to go out there and spend more. The more we spend, then the more people are going to be able to produce and hire more employees. So it's really the spending that matters. Right? So at the end of the day, it's how much we're spending rather than what we're producing that's going to help stimulate that economy. And then the fourth and final difference between the Keynesian side of things versus the classical side of things is that Keynesian economists believe that people respond not necessarily to economic calculation, but to what Keynes called animal spirits. And before you laugh too hard, let me go ahead and explain what he meant by that. So Keynes had a very flowery way of writing, which kind of made some of his texts be either misinterpreted or very hard to interpret. Keynes was not the easiest writer to understand exactly what he was saying, right? One, because again, he was so intelligent, and another, because just the way he wrote was sometimes kind of interpreted as vague or hard to understand. But when Keynes refers to animal spirits, basically what he's referring to is people respond to emotion rather than economic calculation as much. So the idea is that people are going to do things because they just feel it's a certain time to do it, or it's the right thing to do, or not do something because they feel it's the wrong thing to do, rather than being these kind of economic robots or calculators that respond to these predictable changes and incentives, right? So in other words, if you are a classical economist, right? You might be thinking, well, it's a recession, but interest rates are lower. Because interest rates are lower, I can borrow more money more cheaply. So I'm going to go out there, borrow money, and expand my production process. Or, hey, if it's a recession, wages are lower. Because wages are lower, I can produce things more cheaply, so I'm going to hire more people. Whereas Keynes says, people might just think it's a recession, times are bad. I'm scared because times are bad, so now's not a good time to borrow money no matter how low the interest rates are, or to hire more people no matter how low the wages are, right? So in other words, people again respond to maybe their emotions more than this idea of economic calculation or this changes in incentives. So in other words, Keynes is like, we don't know exactly why people do things because sometimes their emotions or personal feelings get in the way, right? So if you were to say, think about whether or not you wanted to go, jogging today, again, a classical economist would say, you might be just out there thinking, hey, I ate some fries earlier, I got all these calories in me, maybe I should burn off some calories. You'd be thinking, do I have time to go jogging? If I do go jogging and I have to take another shower, do I have time to do that as well, right? In other words, you think about the cost of jogging versus the benefits of jogging, and if the benefits outweigh the cost, then you decide to go jogging. Whereas Keynes says, you wouldn't necessarily do that as much as you just be sitting there and maybe all of a sudden the Rocky soundtrack starts playing, you get inspired, and you just get out there and start running, right? So again, people don't necessarily go through this tedious calculation even in their head, right? They just sometimes get motivated to do things based off of emotion, right? So again, that's kind of what Keynes meant when he says people respond to animal spirits. Animal spirits being this idea of like the bull market or the bear market, right? That's where he got like the animal spirits concept from, or at least the terminology for that. So that's kind of the main difference between these two schools of thought. And as you can see, there's certainly reasons to think why economists would be in either of these camps, right? Again, all these kind of make sense to some degree or another, right? In other words, I'd say sometimes people do respond to economic calculation. In fact, maybe most of the time they do, but there are certainly times where people seem to respond to emotion or animal spirits. Whether or not supply creates demand or demand creates supply, you could interpret that as like which side of the scissors does the cutting, right? In other words, they kind of both interact together, and that it's kind of ridiculous or hard to say which one does which. So again, it's the kind of the top two that I think are the biggest differences, right? And we'll talk a little bit about why Keynes believed the things that he did with regards to prices being inflexible and the economy not being able to correct itself, or again, at least not quickly or without some kind of stimulus. All right. So with that in mind, we're going to talk a little bit about Keynes's idea of sticky prices. So here's the reason why Keynes thought that wages and prices were sticky or wouldn't decrease during a recession. Again, he thought that they were kind of sticky, particularly in a downward direction, meaning that they weren't going to change. If they did change, they'd be more likely to go up than down. But here's some reasons why. The reason why you're going to have sticky wages is because this idea that wages are usually held by contracts that are set by large labor unions and corporations, and these contracts aren't always immediately up for renegotiation. So in other words, just because we're in a recession doesn't mean you can automatically lower people's pay, right? Sometimes these large labor unions and corporations get together and form these contracts that say, hey, for the next year or 2 years or however long, right, this is the salary that you are promising your employees. And then they have to pay that salary regardless of the state of the economy, right? So again, if you're a Keynesian economist, you're going to say wages aren't necessarily going to decrease just because this recession is happening, because these wages might be held up by contracts. Right. Now, if you're a classical economist, you'll certainly understand that argument, but you also say, well, again, if we're coming down to a situation where there's a bad recession and a company's either saying, hey, we're going to either have to lower the wages or maybe go out of business entirely, start cutting jobs, then people might be willing to renegotiate those contracts even before they expire. So that'd be kind of the classical side of that argument, right? For example, here at UC Riverside, we're getting emails about the fact that us as professors, we might be having our wages cut as part of the reaction to the coronavirus or be furloughed, which means that we are going to be kind of given unpaid leave until this thing straightens itself out. Right. So with that in mind, again, we do have contracts as to how much the university should be paying us per year. But if cutting our wages are the only way to keep the university open, then again, we might be open to that. Right. So again, you can see how both sides can make the argument either way on this one. And then when it comes to why prices aren't necessarily going to go down during a recession, it's because this idea called menu costs, which is essentially the cost of changing prices. So menu cost was actually a term that was coined by a different economist, Gregory Mankiw. I think is the one who kind of made it most famous in this textbook. But this is kind of following along with the Keynesian idea that it costs money to change prices, or it takes time and effort. It's not something where you just snap your fingers and all of a sudden prices are lower, right? So if you think of like a menu at a restaurant, right, that's nice and printed out and laminated, well, during a recession, it's not like it's very easy to change that menu. You have to go and print out new menus and relaminate it. There's a cost to doing that that may not be worth it, in which case people will keep their prices where they are. So again, the idea of menu cost is that it costs time, effort, and money to go through with a pricing gun and lower all your prices in response to this recession. So it's not quite as easy as just saying, hey, our prices are lower, come buy our stuff now. Right. And so again, if prices don't go down or wages don't go down, then you're not going to have this increase in aggregate demand that the classical economists say will happen. Of course, the classical rebuttal to menu costs is that, well, it's not that difficult to change prices if we really need to, particularly in this day and age where a lot of things are digital, where it can be done fairly quickly and fairly costlessly. If that's what it takes to keep your business afloat, it can certainly be motivate people to do so. Right. So again, following along the Keynesian idea, because of these contracts that keep wages high, or because of this cost of changing prices, prices might stay high, and as a result of these sticky prices, businesses will produce whatever amount is demanded. So rather than saying that, hey, we're going to lower prices, and it's those lower prices that are going to get people into the store, businesses are going to keep prices where they are, they're going to keep wages where they are, and they're going to say, hey, look, if people are in here buying stuff, then we'll go out there and make stuff. But if people aren't buying stuff, right, then we aren't going to make it, right? So again, the price is going to stay where they are, and if people aren't buying stuff, then we aren't going to be producing any more stuff. And during a recession where people have less money, as you can imagine, they're going to buy less. Therefore, businesses are going to produce less, and the economy is going to stay down or stay in a bad way until we do something that gives people more money to go out there and spend at these businesses. Because if people aren't spending the money, businesses aren't going to be producing these goods. Remember, the Keynesians believe that demand creates supply, right? So without that spending, you're not going to have any production, and therefore you're not going to be hiring more people, and the economy is going to stay down with that high unemployment and that low level of production or real GDP. So that's the Keynesian argument. With that in mind, they came up with this idea. This is called the broken window story. I'm going to ask you a question. Is breaking a window good for the economy? Before you say yes or no, though, let me go ahead and tell you the story. So the idea is that there's a kid out there, a ne'er-do-well, rapscallion, or a roustabout, whatever old-timey term you want to use for a person who's up to no good, right? So some kid's out there, and he's thinking, hey, let me go ahead and impress my friends by throwing this rock through the window of a tailor, the person who makes clothes. Right, so the kid shatters the window, throws the rock into it, breaks the glass everywhere, and then him and his friends run out into the night laughing. And the next morning, everybody gathers around the tailor, the person who makes clothes. They look at that shattered window, and they start saying, oh, what an unfortunate situation for that tailor. He's now got to spend money to fix the window. Right, but then somebody else in the crowd says, wait a second, this kid who broke the window, he is not a villain, he is a hero, because by breaking that window, that tailor now has to fix his window, which means he's got to go spend money, and that's going to stimulate the economy. When the tailor spends money to fix the window, then that means that he's got to pay the window repairman. Well, that's going to give the window repairman more money to pay the glass maker, and then it's going to give the glass maker more money to pay their employees. That's going to give the employees more money to spend at stores, including maybe the tailor store, and thus the economy is stimulated. Let's all go out there and break more windows, right? So that's the idea of how spending could create production, or that idea that demand creates supply, and that's what the Keynesians tend to believe, right? So again, I'll leave you up to your own devices as to how you'd answer this question of whether breaking a window is good for the economy. Again, if I were to ask you a question like this, I would give you credit for either answer because it's kind of based on your opinion thus far. All right, so continuing on with this Keynesian idea of spending being very important for stimulating the economy. Right, let's take a look at this concept called the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. So the marginal propensity to consume is the additional amount of income that is consumed, right? So if we stimulate the economy in some way by throwing an additional amount of money in that economy, how much of that money is going to be consumed versus saved. So you can calculate the marginal propensity to consume as additional consumption divided by additional income, right? So again, we just take however much the additional consumption is, we divide it by the additional income that this person receives, and that is the MPC for that individual. Every individual has their own MPC, but we can kind of look at the average MPC of the entire economy, and thus figure out exactly how much the economy will be stimulated by this increase in additional income. So with that in mind, let's go through an example here. So going to exit the full screen so we can use some different colors. But right now, again, just remember that our marginal propensity to consume is equal to that additional consumption divided by additional income. All right. So let's say that the kid does break that window, and then that person has to, the tailor, the person who makes clothes, does have to spend, say, $100 fixing that window. So that's $100 that goes into the window repairman's pocket that wouldn't exist or wouldn't be in that window repairman's pocket if that window wasn't broken, right? So with that in mind, the additional income that window repairman receives is $100. Now let's say that the window repairman of that $100 spends $80 of it and then saves 20 or puts 20 in the bank. Then our marginal propensity to consume is just 80 over 100, or 0.8. Right? And so let's say that the entire economy has the same marginal propensity to consume, or everybody has that 0.8 as their MPC. Right? So again, when we take the person who first receives this $100, right? Again, they have additional income of $100. They're going to consume $80 worth, and then they're going to save $20 worth, right? Well, wherever they spend that money, right, that person now has an additional income of $80. So again, it can be one person or a collection of people that now received $80 that they wouldn't have received if, again, that window wasn't broken and the repairman got the $100 of which he spent 80. So we have an income of 80 that the window repairman got, right? Now they're going to consume 80% of that $80, because again, they also have an MPC of 0.8. Again, just assume that's the average MPC of each individual here, right? So if everybody has an MPC of 0.8, then this person is going to consume 80% of $80, which is $64, and then save the 20% of that $80, or $16. Now, wherever they spent that $64, that person is now going to have some additional income, or income that they didn't have before. And of that $64, again, they're going to consume 80% of that. They also have that MPC of 0.8, right? So 80% of $64 is about $51.20. And then they're going to save the rest. So save that $12.80. And wherever they spent that money, this person now has an income of $51.20, of which they're going to spend 80% of that, and so forth and so on. So you can kind of see how this is going to work, right? That money is going to just keep on being filtered through the economy until there's nothing left to filter, right? And actually we can see that it's going to filter all the way through the economy to the point where this additional $100 is going to create a total of $500 in spending, right? So in other words, this $100 could yield as much as $500 in additional spending after it's done working its way through the economy. Because remember, the original glassmaker spends $80, the person after that spends $64, the person after that spends $51.20, and so forth and so on, right? If you start adding up this consumption across these individuals, right, it's eventually going to reach $500, right? Rather than go through all those iterations there, I'm going to go ahead and just show you an Excel spreadsheet that shows you that every $1 in additional income is going to yield $5 in additional spending if our MPC is equal to 0.8, right? So again, if you look at this spreadsheet here, right, you can see that the marginal propensity to consume, right, is 0.8 here, meaning that with $1, if we spend 80% of that, right, then that's again 80 cents that goes to the next person, right? Whoever spends 80% of that, that's 64 cents who goes to the next person, spending 80% of that, so forth and so on down. I went ahead and went through 30 iterations, so let's say this money flows through 30 different people. If you add all that up, that gets very close to $5. If you add it up across, say, 100 iterations, it'd be even closer to $5, right? So again, it'll get closer and closer to $5 the more that this dollar cycles itself through the economy, right, as people keep spending 80% of it. Right, so again, we could keep on going through 30 of these examples, and you can see that if you added up all of it, then that original $100 would yield $500 in that additional spending. Right, and so again, this is why economists, Keynesian economists in particular, think it's really important that people spend money during these recessions to help pull the economy out of the recession. Every $100 you spend could yield $500 in additional spending, which will help stimulate that production and get the economy moving again, right? Again, if our marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, right? Now, with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about this idea of the expenditure multiplier, which is kind of what we've been referencing here as we've been talking about how much this money increases. So the expenditure multiplier is the change in expenditures, is the idea that a change in expenditures will have a greater impact than whatever the initial change is, right? So as we're spending this money, right, that a little bit of spending, right, could lead to a lot of spending through this multiplier effect, right? And we can calculate the multiplier as 1 over 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. And that's a much easier way to figure out that $1 is going to yield $5 in additional spending if our MPC is equal to 0.8. Right, now, there's an important caveat to this that I want you to understand, right? For this multiplier to be effective, it must come from resources that otherwise would have been unemployed. In other words, for this multiplier to work, right, we have to be adding $1 to the economy that wouldn't have been spent otherwise, right? So before we get into that, let's talk about why this multiplier is important for the Keynesian argument in terms of creating that additional spending. So again, our multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC. So if our MPC is equal to 0.8, this is 1 over 1 minus 0.8, which is equal to 1 over 0.2 or 5. And that's how we know $1 will create additional $5 if our MPC is 0.8. But here's why Keynesians, again, think that spending is so important. Right? If we can just convince people to say spend during recessions versus maybe saving that money, then we can stimulate the economy even further. Right? Let's say that when that kid breaks that window, that Taylor spends $100 on a new window. That window repairman doesn't consume 80 and save 20. Let's say that he consumes 90 and just saves 10, right? So if he consumes 90 and saves 10, then that's now $90 that goes in other people's pockets. And let's say that everybody has the same new marginal propensity to consume of 0.9. Well, if that's the case, now everybody's going to be spending 90% of their additional income, right? And so how's that going to affect this multiplier? Well, now our MPC is 0.9. So 1 over 1 minus 0.9 is 1 over 0.1, which is 10. What that means is that $100 in additional income that the or that the window repairman receives, right, could translate into $1,000 worth of additional spending. Or another way of saying that is that $1 could yield $10 additional spending if the MPC is equal to 0.9. Again, if people spend a little bit more money and save a little bit less during these bad times, then it might help stimulate the economy further. Right. Now, let's say that our marginal propensity to consume goes down. Let's say that instead of spending $80, our window repairman just spends $50 and saves 50 of it. So, didn't need to get there yet. So that's now 50 over 100, which means our marginal propensity consumes 0.5, right? If that's the case, then again, they're going to consume 50 and save 50. That means the income that the next person receives, or the next group of people off that consumption, will just be $50, right? That's going to make our, again, our multiplier much smaller. So if we change our MPC from 0.8 or 0.9 down to 0.5, right, then it's 1 over 1 minus 0.5, which is 0.5, and that's going to be equal to just 2, right? And what this means is that that additional $100 is only going to create $200 worth of additional spending in the economy if our marginal propensity to consume is that low. So, in other words, $1 is going to yield only $2 if our MPC is equal to 0.5. So again, that's why Keynesians think that spending is so important. The more we spend, right, the more money that's going to be flooding through the economy, and that's going to create additional production, and that's going to help stimulate that economy even further. But again, remember the caveat to this rule that we talked about. For this multiplier to work, right, then it's got to come from money that is otherwise not being engaged or not being used. Otherwise, you're just redirecting the spending rather than necessarily adding to it. And what I mean by that is that if that window repairman if that tailor who spent the money fixing his window, if he was going to spend it on anything else, right, if he's going to take that $100 and spend it on something else, then that $100 would still flood through the economy the same way it ever did, only now he wouldn't have to fix his window, right? He could do something else with that money. Right. So, for example, if that tailor was to spend $100 on, say, a new pair of shoes, then the shoemaker would now have $100 more, and if his marginal propensity to consume was 0.8, right, then he would spend $80 of that, and that money would still flood through the economy the same way it did before. Only now, at the end of the day, the tailor has both his window and a new pair of shoes, right, whereas when the window was broken, he had to spend money to fix it. Right, he couldn't buy his new pair of shoes now for $100. He had to spend the $100 to fix the window instead. So at the end of the day, the tailor is worse off by that pair of shoes that doesn't get made or doesn't get purchased because he had to spend that money fixing the window instead. Right, so with that in mind, for this multiplier to be effective, it has to come from, again, spending that otherwise would not have happened. If that spending would have happened anyway, then again, it's not going to add to spending at all. Right. So keep that in mind, because a lot of times the government will try to stimulate the economy by spending money, right? You know, some of people might have gotten their stimulus checks in the mail or direct deposited to them, right, as part of the relief for the coronavirus. And again, the idea is that gives people more money to spend, which will help stimulate the economy. It's a very Keynesian move to send out those checks, right? However, again, where does that money come from? Is the government taking that money from something else that it would have spent money on, or is it going to have to raise our taxes in the future in order to get that money back? If that's the case, right, then again, it might not necessarily stimulate the economy as much as we thought. Right. With that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at this idea of the broken window story actually being called the broken window fallacy. In order to understand that, I have another clip here for you from John Mustache Stossel. Right, let's see what the Stash has to say about this idea of breaking windows to stimulate the economy.
Many people argue that government spending creates jobs, reduces unemployment. For example, if the government spends $70 million on a new road or military aircraft, those projects will employ people. However, there is a problem with this government spending to create jobs theory. Economists call it the broken window fallacy. They say you might as well pay me to do this. That'll create jobs. Jobs for the people who clean up. Jobs for the window repairman. And then there's the multiplier effect. Broken windows also creates jobs for the people who make the truck, the people who painted his truck, the people who deliver the glass, and so on. So let's break more windows. The government creates jobs argument assumes the money is put to better use than just fixing windows. The $70 million goes to building the road or the airplane.
But unless you believe in the tooth fairy, the money has to come from somewhere. Well, it came from taxpayers.
Economist Walter Williams points out that $70 million taken from you now means you have less to spend on a new teapot, or newspapers, or a restaurant. That means fewer jobs for those businesses. Of course, that loss is less visible.
And politicians love that. It's a government policy where you don't see the victims.
If the broken window fallacy were true, then destructive things like hurricanes and earthquakes would be good for the economy. After all, as the recent hurricanes showed, spending increases as people move to clean up and rebuild the damaged areas. But again, if people would not have had to spend that money on the rebuilding of their houses and businesses, they would have spent it on other things like cars, refrigerators, vacations, who knows what. This spending would have increased employment in those industries. Overall, the destructive acts of Mother Nature have reduced the wealth, the houses, the businesses that were destroyed, and there's no reason to expect an increase in overall employment because there's rebuilding. The same is true for government spending. If governments did not spend the funds, taxes would be lower and people would have more money to spend on cars, vacations, whatever they value. That spending would add to employment. The government spending reshuffles jobs. It doesn't create them. Now, if people value the things produced by the government more than the things they would have bought, then the government spending promotes higher living standards. If it's the other way around, however, it'll lower them. So to get the most from our resources, government spending should be based on the merits of the spending, not the fallacious view that it will create jobs.
All right. So again, when looking at this idea of the broken window fallacy, if the government comes out there and says, hey, we're starting this program that's going to employ all these people, right, and we're going to spend this much money to help stimulate the economy, then ask yourself, well, what are you producing with that money, right? Because if what they're producing is more valuable than what you would have done with that money had you not had to been taxed that amount, then again, or what the economy in general would have done that with that money if they had not been taxed that amount, then we can say it's a good project, right? But if what the government's producing is less useful than what you or the economy would have spent that money on if it hadn't been taxed that amount, then that project could be considered wasteful, right? So again, moving on to this broken window story / fallacy, right? Is breaking a window good for the economy? Well, again, if you're a Keynesian economist, you'll say yes, because that could create some additional spending, as that person who owns that broken window, the tailor, will spend more money fixing the window, and that money will help stimulate the economy. So if you say yes to this story, then you are a most likely going to be a Keynesian economist. You fall on that side of that line, right? Now, if you say, well, wait a second, if we didn't break that window and that tailor could have spent that money on something like a new pair of shoes and that same amount of stimulus would have occurred, then breaking the window isn't a good idea, because if you don't break the window, at the end of the day, the tailor has not only his window, but that new pair of shoes. By breaking that window, he now can't buy that pair of shoes because he has to fix the window that he would have had anyway, right? So you haven't made the economy better off. You made it worse off by one pair of shoes that never gets bought as a result of that window having to be fixed, right? So if you're using that particular logic, then you're more along the lines of what we call a classical economist, or you'd fall on that side of that argument, right? So again, whether or not you're Keynesian or classical isn't something I really care about. I do care that you understand the different schools of thought moving forward, because again, this is why we have so much policy debate. a lot of economists will split themselves into either camp, and then a lot of politicians will listen to economists on, say, from one camp or another, right? And again, that's why you'll have debate about what's the right course of action from people who have spent their entire lives studying economic thought. So again, that's a question that I don't really care that you know the answer to in terms of getting a good grade on a quiz or exam. This, however, is a question that I care that you know the answer to in terms of getting a good grade on the quiz or exam, right? Because this one has a definite right answer. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, then what is the expenditure multiplier? All right, well, remember the formula. Our multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. So make sure you just plug that into the formula. So that's going to be 1 over 1 minus 0.75, right? And that's going to be equal to 1 over 0.25, which is going to be equal to 4. So every dollar that gets injected into the economy could create as much as $4 worth of additional spending, our multiplier being 4 in this particular case. Right, so you're going to be able to do a calculation like that on the test. All right, so that is it for our second lecture video here for Chapter 11. Right, again, that one was focused most on the philosophy or philosophical differences between Keynesian and classical economics. Right, so for the next part of the chapter, we're going to start talking about budget deficits and surpluses, how the Keynesian idea of discretionary fiscal policy is going to affect those deficits and surpluses, and how that can relate to the business cycle. Right, so that's what we'll get to in the third and final lecture video for Chapter 11. Until then, please let me know if you have any questions. You can shoot me that email or come visit me during those Zoom office hours. And I look forward to hearing from you. Again, just let me know if you need anything. Take care.